So anyway, thank you all for being here, and without further ado, I'll bring up John Robson to, I guess, tell us where we're going for the next couple of days. Welcome to Alberta, John. Nice to see you back.
Well, thank you very much. It is indeed great to be back here. I don't know, if Canada had a land of the free, it would be Alberta, and if people listen to the EEA, Alberta would be a land of the free, and we will do what we can in the next couple of days to move in that direction for the sake of the province and the country and Western civilization as a whole. I mean, if you're going to dream, dream big, right? Pardon me. Also, can do go away. Nothing without a great deal of technological prep first. There we are. Yeah, well, I was just mumbling to myself about technology. When I have something to say to you that's potentially interesting, I'll try and do that. One of the reasons I like these gatherings, because we always have such cheerful topics on the general principle that firemen run into burning buildings, not away from them. And Western civilization today really does seem to be a burning building. And what's even more concerning is that the arson seems to be coming from inside the house. And the big reason that we're here this year is to ask, why does Canada and the West generally seem to be bent on destroying itself? And how do we make it stop? It's not that we don't have enemies who are keen to destroy us, but they're on the whole even dumber than we are. The real problem is what we're doing to ourselves. And those of you who have heard me speak before will be aware, first of all, that one of my duties is to police the time for the speakers, and then Colonel Redmond will deal appropriately with those who do not heed my gentle direction. And of course, this lays upon me the obligation to get whatever I'm rambling on about done in my allotted time, and I will try and do that. And what I intend to talk about primarily is ideas. I'm an ideas guy. Every time we get together, I cite this book by Richard Weaver with the title, Ideas Have Consequences. And it is one of those titles so good that it kind of saves you the trouble of reading the book, because it just says it all. Ideas matter. Good ideas create good actions. Bad ideas create bad actions. And what is wrong today is bad ideas. So although we will have all sorts of discussion getting into the details of policy, we are fighting ideas. Now, a hand may go up at the back saying we're fighting principalities and powers, and I'll say yes, okay, true, but we're fighting them on the battlefield of ideas first and foremost. David, can you get my slideshow up here, because it's better than my talk? Okay, I like to fill my slideshow with engaging pictures. I think this year it's pretty much all boring text, but I did try and choose the font to be pleasing. And the first slide that you cannot see up there refers to a line from Malcolm Muggeridge, who, having lived the bad life to its fullest, became a Christian convert, a terrific apologist, and he talked about the great liberal death wish. And Conrad Black quoted that fairly recently and called it the great capital L liberal death wish. But I think that is a little too narrow, not that it's unjust, but even, if Justin Trudeau's liberals are keen to wield the torch or the guillotine or whatever it is that they would like to use on our heritage and our country, they're aided and abetted by the NDP, by the activists, other social democratic parties, academics, celebrities, these mobs chanting in the street. The people in power in this country may not be innocent, but they're not exactly giants either, are they? And when you think of the great figures in history, you're not always thinking of good people. A lot of them are quite alarming. But you also don't think of the people running Canada. They will not be in the pantheon. They are as much symptoms as causes. And that isn't to say that one does not, when one has a medical condition, try to treat the symptoms as well as getting to the cause. But I do think that we have to go deeper. And again, as those of you who've been here before know, I'm not a big believer in conspiracy theories, partly because I don't think people are clever enough. But also because, as Thomas Sowell said in A Conflict of Visions, and the first time Danny invited me to one of these conferences and I couldn't make it, but I recorded 3 videos about books that I thought were extremely important, which is sort of the thing I would do. And one of them was Sowell's book. It made a huge impact on me when I was in graduate school. I'm astounded. I spent a lot of time in university, and during that time I read a lot of good books, and almost none of them were on the course curricula. So that was kind of weird even back then. But Sowell wrote this book because he said, I find myself arguing with the same people over and over again on a range of issues that appear superficially to be unconnected. Back then it was the minimum wage, aid to the Nicaraguan Contras, and abortion on demand. Well, today only the third of those still seems to be a live issue, really. But he said this way that the people line up happens too often to be coincidence, but it's too uncoordinated to be a plot. And to me, it really is that there are certain kinds of ideas that tend to produce a flourishing society, and there are certain kinds of ideas that tend to destroy a society, and our institutions and popular culture have by and large been captured by the wrong ones. Now, there's another book that I had long intended to read by James Burnham called Suicide of the West, an essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. And I finally got it as an audiobook, so I listened to it while walking the dog. Thank you. There we are. And I actually thought the title was a lot better than the book in that case. But the point of it fundamentally is that liberalism seems to be a set of ideas that, as was summed up by John O'Sullivan, every practical defeat for the West, from Suez to Katanga, is rationalized as a moral gain for humanity, and thus for universal Western values. And O'Sullivan called liberalism a sedative. I think it's a little worse than that. They give you a sedative and then they give you something else, right? So we're in a lot of trouble, which I say not to discourage you, but to inspire you. You have somehow or other, like Elrond's council, we have been called together to do works that are great. And if we seem like an improbable bunch to be asked to do it, well, we're here and they're not, so it's up to us. And we're just going to somehow or other snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Another, slide 3, please. And another of these quotes, these things are everywhere, and they start to be ominous, is a line from Arnold Toynbee. I can't advance them, right? Okay, there we are. Civilizations die from suicide, not murder. And again, I think this is the case, not again, that there aren't people wanting to murder our civilization, but they don't even have to bother. And again, their attempts are often quite feeble. Ours, on the other hand, one of the scary things about Western civilization is how good it is at whatever it is currently doing, including, alas, destroying itself. And in the course that I teach a history of Western civilization at Augustine College in Ottawa, and one of the challenges I put to the students early on, I say, when you think about Western civilization and its extraordinary dynamism, its habit continually of questioning itself, of changing things, of asking, what is this about? Why do we do this way? What kind of idiots are we, and so on, is whether the seeds of the current disaster were not inherent way back at the beginning when Greece led to Rome and then to Christianity and so on. Was it always there? And there's again, slide 4, if we can get to it, which is, in the West, it is the exceptions which break through the universal. And in this is rooted the perpetual disquiet of the West, its continual dissatisfaction, its inability to be content with any sort of fulfillment. And that's a somewhat ominous passage, partly because it implies that if we ever really did create the good life and arrive at the truth, we would just keep on going. So it's not impossible that at some point we really did kind of get it right, and then we just kept on questioning and undermining and producing a disaster. And there's no flip solution to that, because this perpetual disquiet, this interest in the exceptions, this willingness to hear the other side of the story, is the strength and the glory of the West. It's our capacity to make room for dissenting ideas, for dissenting habits, even dissenting cultures, and to adopt what is best and discard what doesn't work that makes Western civilization the beacon and the challenge to everybody. That there is no part of the world today that is not westernized or else in bitter revolt against westernization, because all of this stuff works. As Julius Caesar once said, slide 5, please. Thud. Sorry, slide 6. According to Sallust, anyway, he said, our ancestors, gentlemen, never lacked wisdom or courage, and they were never too proud to take over a sound institution from another country. In short, if they thought anything that an ally or an enemy had was likely to suit them, they enthusiastically adopted it at Rome, for they would rather copy a good thing than be consumed with envy, because they had not got it. And that is why the West towers above the rest of the world on any measure that you look at: GDP, military strength, Nobel Prizes, cultural compositions, morally rotten or morally inspiring. It's the West that creates the novel. It's the West that creates the symphony. It's the West that creates Parliament. It's the West that creates the university. And then we eat their food, right? You could be in a fairly small town in rural Alberta and you would find cuisine from around the world, made with much, more wholesome and abundant ingredients probably than in the place where it originated. And we wouldn't want to be one of those societies that have this stifling mediocrity. The places that anytime someone comes up with a new idea, they go, haram, and start throwing stones. We wouldn't want to be like that. But the trouble is, along with the best food and music and so on, we also have the best decadence and death wish, right? The center cannot hold. All things fall apart. And this is a huge problem, right? You'd think that the West could make room, for instance, for gay couples without undermining the traditional family. That seems to be what we're like and nobody else, that we could have a dominant religion but not persecute Quakers for not taking their hats off, or atheists, or other people who don't share those habits. But increasingly, it's starting to look as though that's not true, that somehow the exceptions have broken through and overwhelmed the rules. And remember what Yeats warned about in 1919, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I think you see that everywhere. And again, my challenge in large part here is that we must not lack conviction. And here's an interesting sort of trivial example of all of this. Canada has a special representative on combating Islamophobia, and we would, right? And she recently whinged that over the past several months, Canadian Muslims have shared their growing concerns about an increase in anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian, and anti-Arab backlash that has already led to loss of income, threats to current or future employment, harassment, violence, vandalism, and exclusion. She didn't cite any examples, but what she was talking about is that people don't want to hire you if you're militantly pro-Hamas, right? Slide 7, I shall quote that great commentator on public affairs, me. I responded on X, Canadians have the right to free speech, but not to speech without consequences, because others have the right to free association, including not hiring people whose views they abhor. If you object to this deal, you're exploiting freedom, not upholding it, right? The exception is breaking through, and they are using free speech in order to stifle the speech and other rights of other people. And the question is, can we hold the line? Because if this person got into power, there is no chance that you would be allowed to draw a cartoon of Muhammad. No chance whatsoever. And one of the weird things about this situation that I think increasingly all know is true, slide 8 please, this comes from Jay Budachevsky. And again, there's so many inspiring people here. Jay Budachevsky was an existentialist philosopher at the University of Texas at Austin who thought things through just a little too deeply, and Christ found him, and now he is a very deep thinker and theologian. Previous civilizations have degenerated. Previous ages have marched into the dark not knowing that they were marching into the dark. But in any previous time were artists, scholars, and thinkers so eager to explain that degeneration was really progress. And there again you have the problem that confronts us when we try to make things right. Is people say, oh, you hate money and progress too, do you? And we have to convince people that the suicide of the West is not progress, and it's really hard. All right, I have the power. Look what's happening in Canada today. The public, to some extent, and those in authority, to a very large extent, are shrugging off fiscal ruin, foreign agents in Parliament, mass immigration overwhelming us from the housing to culture to religious tolerance, the arson of churches, and they're calling it progress. And again, I can go on citing these warnings endlessly. I'm sorry I don't have pictures instead, but Malcolm Muggeridge again. Previous civilizations have been overthrown from without by the incursion of barbarian hordes. Ours has dreamed up its own dissolution in the minds of our intellectual elites. Not Bolshevism, which Stalin liquidated along with the old Bolsheviks. Not Nazism, which perished with Hitler in his Berlin bunker. Not fascism, which was left hanging upside down from a lamppost along with Mussolini and his mistress. None of these, history will record, was responsible for bringing down the darkness in our civilization, but liberalism. A solvent rather than a precipitate, a sedative rather than a stimulant, a slough rather than a precipice, blurring the edges of truth, the definition of virtue, the shape of beauty, a cracked bell, a mist, a death wish. That's pretty bad, right? To borrow a line from Captain James Tiberius Kirk, don't mince words. What do you really think? Ambrose Pierce once said that self-evident means evident to oneself and no one else. But it does seem to be more and more evident that the West is committing suicide, and that the people who don't like the West aren't unaware of it, they're just glad. The process itself is becoming more and more visible. And one of the good things about that is that more and more people are objecting to it. For instance, this is in the National Post. Avi Ben-Lolo of the Abraham Global Peace Initiative. By attempting to force Israel into a ceasefire with a madman with an end-of-time plan, the international community, whatever that is, reveals an utter weakness that is undermining Western civilization. So there's one symptom. It depends what you're interested in, where you might particularly be inclined to see it. Michael Schellenberger, again, a former progressive who is caroming rapidly in the right direction. Why do civilized people hate civilization? This is an excellent question because, again, if you look at those encampments, civilized is about the last word that you would use for them. Remember somebody at National Review years ago describing these young people looking as though they'd shown up late for the sack of Rome. And again, that line I quoted from Ronald Reagan at dinner last night, they don't look particularly capable of sacking anything, but since we're going to do it for them, that's not a big deal. And then there's Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Muslim apostate who has recently embraced Christianity, that for a time many refused to believe that anything was actually wrong. The tide of populism was a momentary manifestation of frustration. The decline of each of our institutions was viewed in isolation as a problem of poorly selected leadership, which could be corrected after the next election or a changing of the guard. The sense of hopelessness that people felt was explained away as the temporary consequence of the rapid transition away from industrialism and the ushering in of the digital age. In this light, though there were problems, they were distinct from each other and would be corrected in time. Can any serious person believe this now? And again, never underestimate the capacity of serious people to believe serious errors. But I think there is a certain encouraging recognition that things that have been underway for a long time, because some of my examples are quite old, as non-historians use that term. In fact, there's a line from C.S. Lewis that the practical result of education in the spirit of the Green Book must be the destruction of the society which accepts it. And of course, education is very much in the hands of the kind of people he was talking about in The Abolition of Man. So, I don't probably need to point out to people in this room how bad things have gotten in education, that the universities have succumbed to madness, to the point, especially in the humanities, as they were once known, or the liberal arts. Even if they wanted to hire conservative faculty, they couldn't, because no conservative now gets a PhD. When I went to graduate school, the situation was already troubling, but my dissertation advisor was actually a Republican. He was an Eisenhower Republican, but times had changed. When he was a kid, in his house, if you said the name Roosevelt, you had your mouth washed out with soap. So his parents were not Eisenhower Republicans, but times changed. They wouldn't use the dime when it had FDR's face on it. But you also see this mass immigration, right, which is clearly driven not by the fact that we need more houses for all the immigrants, so we have to bring in immigrants to build houses for the immigrants and then more immigrants to build houses for the immigrants building houses, but by a hostility to Western culture, that it is a deliberate policy choice across the Western world to bring in large numbers of people from non-Western civilizations on the grounds that their values were better than ours. And when you see the Hamas people disrupting the Pride Parade, you get confirmation of Edmund Burke's jibe that birds of prey are not gregarious. So again, there are some internal contradictions on that side, but we need to worry about our own. And then you get the problem, for instance, of the Canadian military. Even the American military is in some trouble, but our military, we could not fight anything bigger than a smuggling operation. We don't have the personnel, we don't have the ethos, and we don't have the ammunition. And so what do we get in the middle of all of this? Lieutenant General Jenny Carignan. That's just what I think we need leading us in battle against the savage hordes, as someone who goes by Jenny. And this National Post story says, Carignan takes over a military in transition amid the ongoing culture change efforts and the urgent task of trying to rebuild its ranks after years of declining recruitment and poor retention. And it didn't apparently occur to the journalist any more than to Jenny there that maybe these two tasks contradict one another. That maybe the relentless determination to undermine the warrior ethos is why people don't want to join the military. And thank you. And again, I'm going to come back here to the ideas have consequences issue, because if you're wondering, did the Prime Minister do it on purpose in order to disarm us? I think the answer is no. I think the Prime Minister is a much greater fool than that. I wrote about this back in February for the Aristotle Foundation, another sign of hope, by the way, that such organizations are springing up. Our problem is not that the Prime Minister aims to subject Canadians to foreign conquest or is indifferent to our security. Rather, he and those around him are genuinely convinced that in the long run, only a truly woke society can ever be secure. They actually believe social justice warriors will fight better than traditional warriors. And in case they don't, everyone will love us, so it won't matter. That's what's going on in Ottawa. This is actually how they're thinking. And if this pattern of thought has a certain kind of deliberate depravity to it, it doesn't mean it's not sincere. There is nothing worse than sincere depravity. There's almost horrible naivete that C.S. Lewis talks about in Paralandra. And again, I've said this before and I'll say it again, especially if you try to give me a conspiracy theory. When people say something you don't agree with and do something you don't agree with, it's because they think something you don't agree with. And if they're wrong, it has consequences, as in Canada's current crumbling woke military. The reason people don't accept our conclusions is they don't accept our premises. And that's why I say that we are fighting primarily on the field of ideas here. And there was another line, when Russia invaded Ukraine, John Kerry objected to it being a distraction from the true crisis of climate change, which he called existential. And someone said the existential crisis is caused by people like him. If we're going to die, we should at least try for death with dignity. And John Kerry's the last person capable of providing that. That was Conrad Black again. Don't mince words. And I know there's some disagreement, probably including in this hall, about how central Ukraine is to the defense of the West. But I don't think there's a lot of disagreement in here that the defense of the West is important. And that's the thing that a lot of people really, truly don't agree with. Remember, right after 9/11, that Sunera Tobani out at UBC said that women would never be free globally until American influence was eradicated. Now, there's a weird read on history, but not a fake one. She really meant it, and that's a bad thing. So, and you're moving on. There's all these other areas where we have these problems. For instance, our heritage, right? Toppling statues of Sir John A. Macdonald and Queen Victoria in broad daylight with no criminal consequences. And In the United States, they just took Laura Ingalls Wilder's name off a U.S. Children's Book Award because of the anti-Native and anti-Black sentiments in her work, right? Little House on the Prairie is now Little House Down the Memory Hole. And then I got this thing from Audible. I've become a big fan of audiobooks. I don't know, I'm too tired to read when I finally get to bed or some feeble thing of that sort. But as they were trying to convince me to listen to this, the Mongol army led by Genghis Khan subjugated more lands and people in 25 years than the Romans did in 400. True. In nearly every country the Mongols conquered, they brought an unprecedented rise in cultural communication, expanded trade, and a blossoming of civilization. No, they didn't. Vastly more progressive than his European or Asian counterparts, Genghis Khan abolished torture, granted universal religious freedom, and smashed feudal systems of aristocratic privilege. What? Seriously? It's like there was a display on the Vikings at the Smithsonian back in 2000 that said, in a way, the Viking longship was the internet of the year 1000, connecting places and people who themselves could not even imagine what lay beyond that wide sea or that mountain range. And I'm pleased to say that the journalist writing about that one back then got in touch with an expert on Vikings who... At the Viking Center in York, who retorted, they didn't call him Eric Bloodaxe because he was good with children. So, common sense and plain speaking will get us a long way in the face of this nonsense. But, you know how bad it is. We've got the Prime Minister agreeing that there's a genocide in Canada while he's Prime Minister and not stepping down, let alone surrendering himself for trial. This is an assault on the meaning of words, right? As I recently said, that means either he doesn't really think there's a genocide, or he doesn't really think genocide is bad, or he doesn't really think he's in charge. And to some extent, I believe it's the latter. Trudeau is the resistance to the establishment, this mythical beast that actually perished around about 1966. And this is also true in Australia. I've been following stories, and they cut the funds to a Shakespeare festival down in New Zealand because of the fact that Shakespeare is paternalistic and a canon of imperialism. And this was being objected to. They said, instead, we should have legends from the Maori heritage. And, I don't mean to seem uncivil, but are we talking about the time where you ate your enemies? Because that's kind of bad. Right? I mean, Shakespeare may be many things, but an advocate of cannibalism as a religious practice was not on the list. And another place, of course, where you see this problem, and again, this is maybe the worst one, is the demographic suicide of the West. The fact that Western people don't have children at replacement rate anymore. This is an astonishing abdication, an abandonment of hope, right? Having kids is the ultimate expression of hope because you will never sleep again and everything will be dirty and your kids will sass you. I often see parents with young children with, there's some wonderful place and the kid's having a screaming fit, and I'm thinking, this isn't what you imagined when you said to one another, let's have a baby, is it? But we've all been there, right? I remember a guy that I TA'd for down in Texas. One time he was on a flight with his very young daughter who was, of course, crying. And somebody next to him said, is your kid going to cry throughout the whole flight? And he said, yeah, so you might as well move now. But it's astonishing, this demographic winter that is taking over the entire Western world. I mean, it started, people who lose wars with the West go into demographic decline, right? That's where it starts, from Spain to France to Russia to Japan, but then the West itself is getting into this situation, and there was actually Dan Gardner, who I used to work with at the Ottawa Citizen, but who kind of went from being a libertarian of normally sane proportions to being I know not what. Mocked the idea that the Pope had put forward that godlessness was to blame for the baby bust, because he said, well, it's worldwide. And the answer is, yeah, well, so is godlessness, right? It seemed fairly straightforward to me. And I also, as a challenge to all of the best and brightest in the societies, if there's no babies, who are you going to socially engineer? And of course, lots of countries are now trying to pay people to have babies, but that isn't why people have babies. Especially because you can't pocket the change, then drop them through the orphanage slot. And a classic Norwegian imam who said out loud to a Norwegian newspaper in 2006, "We're the ones who will change you." Just look at the development within Europe, where the number of Muslims is expanding like mosquitoes. I thought, no, if I were to compare Muslims to mosquitoes, doubtless I would have a visit from the thought police. But this was an imam doing it, so take my word for it. And I saw this in a souvenir store almost 20 years ago. So there are so many examples of this, and again, we'll talk in more detail about them as we get our many splendid presentations on such a wide range of issues in the next couple of days. But I want to mention that if there's been a fascination in the West with the phenomenon of civilizations that decline and fall, at least since it happened to Rome, or possibly you go back to Athens and say, well, here was a civilization that did everything right, just about, and lost the Peloponnesian War, and became an adjunct to these Romans who bought art by the ton. So that was a bit of a come down there. You know, Gibbon thought Christianity had done it because it made people wimps. Augustine had to answer that charge right in real time. People said, oh, yeah, the empire went Christian, and now look at the mess. And I could give a whole lecture on that, but I won't. Instead, I will quote the Pope, previous Pope, Benedict XVI, who said, "Europe is infected by a strange lack of desire for the future. Children, our future, are perceived as a threat to the present, as though they were taking something away from our lives. Children are seen, at least by some people, as a liability rather than as a source of hope. Here it is obligatory to compare today's situation with the decline of the Roman Empire. In its final days, Rome still functioned as a great historical framework, but in practice, its vital energy had been depleted." And I would have liked to say to him, Your Popeness, I think you overestimate people's historical knowledge. I think there's a lot of people out there not comparing the present situation to the fall of Rome because they know little about the present and nothing about the fall of Rome. But nevertheless, I sympathize with the concept. Are we living through something we've seen before with similar causes and similar consequences, including turning our backs on the notion of normal domestic life as the greatest felicity that a person can enjoy who has had 18 hours sleep in the last 5 days? And so the various theories exist about why history goes in cycles, why you have this pattern of the rise and fall, including this notion that vigorous people generate wealth and security make people decadent, decadence causes them to lose their vigor, and so on. And there's some argument in favor of that, but I'm going to say, let's not get hysterical here. For two reasons, and one of them is as a revisionist Marxist, Edward Bernstein, supposedly said, but I've never been able to track it down. If he didn't say it, he missed the opportunity of his lifetime. Men have heads. People actually think. They think about what they're doing. We are not chemical experiments. I'll get back to that later, too. But the other question is whether, as Toynbee also implied, civilizations generically follow common patterns, that a Chinese dynastic cycle and the fall of Rome are essentially parallel phenomena. And I'm going to say no, the West is different. For better or worse, the West is different. And one of the reasons the West is different is the West has a story. It is an unfolding of something that goes from a starting point to a finishing point. And it's not coincidental that the Bible is the same. I mean, a lot of people talk as though all religions were just cut from the same cloth. They all think God is love. They all say don't kill one another. They just wear different funny hats. But that is not true. That is wrong on so many levels, including that no other scripture is a historical story. The Bible, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Then how did man come to be corrupt? What did God promise to do about it? What did God do about it? And what are we meant to do about it? And how does it all end with the fireworks of Revelation? Right? The Quran's not structured that way. Roman mythology, such as it was, a pile of rubbish atop Mount Olympus, had no comparable structure. And history as a discipline of inquiring into the past to try and figure out what happened and why and what does it tell us about what's going on now is a uniquely Western thing. So I'm going to say no, Western civilization is different. Its decline and fall, if they happen, will be hideously dramatic and unlike that of some Chinese dynasty whose principal contribution to the world was yet more phony historical marks on excellent pottery. But this is about 4 years ago almost. Terence Corcoran, who's a tremendous columnist with the Financial Post, he did this piece about what on earth has gone wrong, saying we had the Enlightenment brought us so many gains, like the 18th century. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Well, yeah, in the 18th century we were there yet. Right? We had parliamentary democracy, limited government, flourishing culture, the great musicians, the great painters, everything. It would have been time to just sit down and party in the sunlit uplands, and instead we went on to one disaster after another. And I had answered back that if the 18th century was that great, it is difficult to see how it contained the seeds of its own destruction. That there must have been things going on that were more ominous than he was giving them credit for. And it's even conceivable, I have to say. I suggested it might go back to the end of the Middle Ages, and he said, I'll leave that to you. And I said, your proposal is acceptable. That the Reformation, not to ruffle feathers here, but there is a certain issue. William James pointed out that if God is omniscient and omnipotent, we are puppets. There is nothing that we can do to change the course of destiny which his will has from the beginning delineated and decreed. Calvinism and fatalism are the logical corollaries of such a definition. The same test applied to mechanistic determinism issues in the same results. If we really believed in determinism, we would become Hindu mystics and abandon ourselves at once to the immense vitality which uses us as marionettes. Of course, we do not accept these somber philosophies. The human intellect repeatedly proposes them because of their logical simplicity and symmetry, but life ignores and overflows them and passes on. Well, maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe, and I shall argue this without exceeding my time, I hope, maybe that's what's happened to us. And I don't know if you've ever had the misfortune to encounter, I'll skip that, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, these three 18th century masters of deep sleep. Incredible soporific prose, no need for a sleep aid if you read these guys. But what's really interesting about them is that they look like the most improbable radicals because they wear frock coats and wigs. But the three of them in the field of philosophy do something quite ominous. They turn it away from looking at the world and asking questions like, what is justice, to asking, how do we know anything? How can we understand a world using flawed minds? And then the next problem, of course, becomes, how can we understand flawed minds using flawed minds? And philosophy sucks itself up into its own navel. And this is actually, I will go back to the previous slide because this is from C.S. Lewis, the fate of John Wither in That Hideous Strength. This, when disaster overtakes him and his diabolical plans. He said, incredible how little this knowledge moved him. It could not because he had long since ceased to believe in knowledge itself. What had been in his far-off youth merely an aesthetic repugnance to realities that were crude or vulgar had deepened and darkened year after year into a fixed refusal of everything that was in any degree other than himself. He had passed from Hegel into Hume, thence through pragmatism, and thence through logical positivism, and out at last into the complete void. The indicative mood now corresponded to no thought that his mind could entertain. And again, I'm going to suggest that we live in a society that is dominated by this idea, that only the self exists, that there is no true knowledge, and that therefore our will is the only thing to substitute for it. But in a phrase I cherish from a former United States Senator Malcolm Wallop, essential questions thrown out through the front door often climb back in through the window. Reality is hard to get rid of. And as Chesterton also said, there is in this materialism a mad indifference to real thought. By disbelieving in the soul, it comes to disbelieve in the mind. And so when I talked at the beginning about this fight over ideas, it's really a very deep fight over the possibility of coherent thought. We're in deep water here, folks, and we might as well know it. It goes on from Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. It gets worse. In another of these, hey, the 18th century was great, what on earth has happened to us? Neil Postman asked in kind of panic, what self-understanding is there to find in the 20th century? Freud's insistence that reason is merely a servant of the genitalia. You think, well, how did genitalia get in here? What first thing in the morning? But it's funny how often people start talking dirty when they stop believing in real ideas, including those about morality. And then you get stuff like this, first man ever on the cover of Vogue wearing a dress. And I have this in my files under brainless, horny giggle. But it has this kind of philosophical basis that we don't believe in the mind anymore. And indeed, in some sense, we can't. Daniel Boorstin, this back in the 50s, he said that in the time of the American Revolution, men were inclined to take their opponents at their word. The revolutionary debate seems to have been carried on in the belief that men meant what they said. But in this age of Marx and Freud, we have begun to take it for granted that if people talk about one thing, they must be thinking about something else. Ideas are treated as the apparatus of an intellectual sleight of hand, by which the speaker diverts the audience's attention to an irrelevant subject while he does the real business unobserved. But it's worse than that, because the speaker is themselves in the grip of either Marx's socioeconomic forces or Freud's dark subconscious sexual ones, and thus doesn't themselves understand what's going on. As Marshall McLuhan put it, it's often said that the major development of this century has been the discovery of the night world of dreams. By day, we are the bottom half of a double boiler. We are all steamed up, but we don't know what's cooking. Funny thing about McLuhan could sure turn a phrase. He couldn't write a coherent paragraph, which is funny for a communications guru. But you see, what did happen is that we went on from Locke, Berkeley, and Hume to, again, this guy writing about Freud, the explanation of the irrational is a special task of the 20th century, but if you're irrational, good luck with that, mate. And so here's one of the villains of the piece. And I bring this up partly because, like, everybody was young once, right? It's always funny to see a picture of somebody as a kid, and then later on you go, oh, Charles Darwin, as some people see him, who, when he died, was buried in Westminster Abbey, because that's what you do with distinguished people in Britain. But Darwin, of course, wasn't just an atheist. He was the proponent of a theory that, if taken seriously, necessarily abolishes God and man with it. Because according to Darwin, everything that you do and everything that you think is the product of your genes trying to make more of your genes. And they're good at that, at least sometimes. Some animals go extinct pretty quickly. But any thought you may have, including about morality, is just a trick of the genes trying to make you reproduce successfully. Now, the downside is that's also true of Darwinism. But, it's hard to know what to do about that. And then you got Karl Marx, and Marx says, no, phooey, it's not genes, it's socioeconomics, right? Your relationship to the means of production determines everything you think. And therefore, none of your thoughts are really yours, and you have no free will, and you have no head, and you are just a robot acting out class interests. And then you get Freud, and he says, no, it's all sex. You're basically a really bad, dirty book. And then, again, who is this kid? Any guesses? It's Groucho Marx. No, it's Albert Einstein. And so Einstein had the theory of relativity that proved that everything was relative, or so people think. It didn't, but nobody knew that. And so on and on and on it goes with a civilization that stops believing in belief. Stops believing in ideas, stops believing in truth, and then all sorts of dark things get loose. Now, Philip K. Dick, who's a science fiction writer, at least nominally, but a philosopher in real life, said reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. And of course, there's always been people pushing back on this. And they've been pushing back because people have realized from the beginning what a dismal picture of the world this was. Nobody wants to be in a deterministic universe. And as Edmund Burke said, I allow that if no supreme ruler exists, wise to form and potent to enforce the moral law, there is no sanction to any contract, virtual or even actual, against the will of prevalent power. On that hypothesis, let any set of men be strong enough to set their duties at defiance, and they cease to be duties any longer. But it's a lot worse than that, because if there's no such thing as truth, you couldn't have a duty even if you wanted to. And again, this is so prevalent. This is just from some random textbook of American history. The past, of course, can never change, but our understanding of the past changes constantly. Well, in that case, why write the book, right? Because, then our understanding of the past will change, and it'll change, and it'll change, and none of those understandings will have any value whatsoever. But point it out as you will, each generation interprets the past, including art, according to its own needs. There is no truly objective history, only our interpretation. So I can look at the Mona Lisa and think it's an anti-war protest, or you can look at Guernica and say it's a pastoral scene, or you can just skip the art gallery altogether, because if you went in there, you'd just make something up. In some sense, this is completely preposterous, but it's everywhere. The director of San Diego's Museum of Contemporary Art said, with respect to the content of the work, and whether we think it is a good artwork or a bad artwork, we really have no position on that. To which one might say, then how do you decide what to include in your museum? But, it's sort of wasting argument on imbecility. And then there was this, the Atlantic Daily emailed me a thing, why no singer has replaced Lady Gaga? And I mean, I'm immediately like, why would you want them to? Apparently the explanation is that there is no new superstar singer as thrillingly meaningless as Lady Gaga. He's like, okay, fine. Your proposal is acceptable. What's thrillingly meaningless about whoever this person was? Not one of whose songs I would recognize, I hasten to add. Or this puff piece on Cardi B's outfits, and I don't know who Cardi B is, but that's not an outfit. That looks like she shot a rug, right? And the simple truth is this stuff is ugly. That's what this is. There's a clear, pertinent truth. And yet, recently Bob Plamondon wrote a book, The Truth About Trudeau, which reminded me why I hated Trudeau Sr. as much as I did. And it was reviewed by Andrew Cohen, who's a marquee columnist and professor in the Ottawa Citizen, and his review ended up with, ultimately Plamondon has his Trudeau and I have mine. So again, this is casually asserts that there is no truth about Trudeau. And so we can all have our own Trudeau. I don't know, maybe he's got 7 arms or something. Maybe he's still alive. You're like, what? This doesn't even mean anything, but of course it's not meant to. Or this, are you kidding me? Citing religious rights and the dark prophecy of a terrible black snake that will bring harm to its people, a Sioux Indian tribe returned to court Tuesday in an 11th-hour push to keep the Dakota Access Pipeline from carrying its first crude oil. And the thing about this, it's not so much the gall of it, is that nobody believes the pipeline is the snake of some terrible prophecy, not even the people saying it. But the problem is, none of them believe anything. So you might as well say this. And people out of politeness will not say bosh to your big white snake or black snake. Or this one again, a Huffington Post piece a decade ago. Every woman has her own definition of success, but there are certain traits that most successful women share. So not every woman has her own definition. And again, I can think of things that aren't in any woman's definition of success. Gambia could become the first country in the world to reverse a ban on female genital cutting, for instance. That surely is not any woman's definition of success, or at least not a sane one. And all of this is obviously nonsense, which is good because we have to get rid of it. As C.S. Lewis once put it, no thought is valid if it can be fully explained as a result of irrational causes. And materialism, Darwinism, Marxism, Freudianism, deconstructionism all say that all thought is the product of irrational causes, including the one I just articulated. Therefore, it goes down in flames. As Lewis also pointed out about his conversion, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Because we all know that there is truth. We all know there are things that we have to do. And indeed, James Shaw said, to prove that reason is valid presupposes that reason is valid. But the same is true of proving that reason is invalid. If you want to abolish reason using reason, you are necessarily relying on reason, and we shouldn't let them get away with it. It's ridiculous that we get buffaloed by these people. And again, Lewis says, if nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved. Similarly, if nothing is obligatory for its own sake, nothing is obligatory at all. And there's this poem recently published, recently as I would use that term these days, Let Reality Return to Our Speech. Okay, this is the critical thing that has to happen. This is the call to action here, as well as the program for this conference. Again, Louis, you can't go on seeing through things forever. The point of seeing through something is to see something through it. You want to see through the window to the garden, but what if the garden's transparent? And again, Chesterton, the same tu quoque, I deny that biology can destroy the sense of truth, which alone can even desire biology. No truth which I can find can deny that I am seeking the truth. My mind cannot find anything which denies my mind. And by the way, somebody did a poll and found out that 2/3 of American millennials didn't know what Auschwitz was. That may be one reason why, but at the same time, they're out there fighting evil, right? So they're not actually, nobody cannot believe in this stuff. And I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but that's the whole of Yeats' second coming poem, but we won't do that because I am bent and determined, I know that. And I'm also trying to get down through my... So another warning about reality from Aldous Huxley: reality cannot be ignored except at a price. And the longer the ignorance is persisted in, the higher and more terrible becomes the price that must be paid. And that's where we are now. But Christianity always rises again because it has a God who knows the way out of the grave. So our job here is to speak the truth firmly, not unpleasantly, and not to let them get away with saying there is no truth, because that's the ground on which we win or lose the battle, fundamentally. We have to bring up specific ideas of truth, which is what our speakers are going to do. We have to stand firm when it's challenged, but we must not let them say everything is relative, that's your truth, this is mine. It is not possible to build a civilization on that basis, and though the West necessarily goes there, it doesn't stop there. It doesn't perish there. It goes on to a much wiser, more mature, and powerful understanding of the truth. And that's what we're here to do.
Thank you very much, John. That's exactly what we're here to do.